Hi, Dave.
Hi. You're probably gonna want to edit this part out.
Hey, you got a guitar.
It's lovely.
Oh, are you serenading
Can you
me?
hear me yet? Well, I'm gonna play you a song and see if you recognize it.
Aloha, this is Dan, and after 9-year hiatus, I am back here with
Dave.
That's my twin brother, Dave, who now resides in Baltimore, Maryland. I think the last time he was on the show, you were up in Buffalo. So that's one thing that's changed in the past 9 or so years. Thanks for coming back on, Dave.
Oh, you're welcome.
Not that you and I recording a podcast together is really that different than you and I just talking about all the stuff that we've talked about. It's not that the our interests and discussions have changed or stopped over the years. Just that I was inundated with life stuff. I was just getting a little overwhelmed with all the projects I had given myself. So I took a break. But as I said in the supposed quasi final episode of this original run of this podcast, the music part of it, it was never meant to go away forever necessarily, but I just didn't see myself making stuff for it during that time, and I was right. It was a good time to kind of put it on hold. But now kids are older and life is more kind of just sustaining and going along, so I'm getting back into the swing of production stuff. And I thought it'd be an interesting little experiment to kind of touch base on where we are now compared to where we were almost 9 years ago, when we had talked about a lot of different themes and ideas and things that were going on in the music industry and in our own musical journeys and life and passion. Because it's a decade is a really long time in the lifespan of bands and the music industry, especially now, with the internet. Like, things change so fast. As I wanted to get the show back up and running, I went back and listened to our old episodes, and I found there was a lot of interwoven ideas and topics and themes and stuff that just kind of naturally came up over and over again through that show. So I thought it'd be fun to kind of touch back on some of that stuff and just see what's happened since then, and I don't know, kind of get the ball rolling again on moving forward. I don't really have any like specific plans or release schedules or structures for what this part of the music part of the podcast is going to be. But if something comes up, I thought it'd be a good platform to, have a place to put it. Okay, so let's just kind of go through the list that I have here, and we can see where it goes. One big thing that was happening, because our podcast was never meant to be metal or heavy music only, but that's definitely the kind of music that you and I gravitate to more than other stuff. Would you agree? In general, the big thing that was happening about 10-ish years ago in the heavy world was you called it diarrhea core, I called it Insanecore, and it was our third episode where we dedicated a whole episode to discussing it, but we talked about it a lot more here and there. I definitely think it was like an offshoot of metalcore, where once metal got to a point where, like, new metal was kind of not cool anymore, and it had outgrown itself and it become a commodity, just like what happened with like grunge or hair metal or whatever. It was just
I probably wouldn't use that term again these days. I've matured a lot since then.
Which one? New metal?
No, just saying, like, oh, diarrhea cores, I can't stand,
okay, yeah, fair enough.
I'll be more objective these days.
Fair enough. Well, that's and that's one thing that happens over time, is hopefully we get more wise, right?
Yeah.
But that we just talked to, that I think that was like the big movement at the time. It was like the post new metal, post metal core, like standard metal core, like the Kill Switch and God Forbid, and like even Lamb of God to a degree. Like those bands had almost become like legacy, or Hatebreed is another one. Like they become like legacy bands at that point, even like 10 years ago. And you know what I mean? And like so the metalcore sound was pretty established and almost not cliche in a bad way, but it was, So it seemed like heavy music didn't really know
It
what to do
became
with
its own
itself.
pattern, you know, like
Yeah.
every big movement that which doesn't set out to be like a pattern of itself, but just goes that way. Every genre does that.
But that's why I looking back at it now, I think at the time we were really reacting to how unlistenable a lot of that stuff was. And I'm thinking back to bands like A Day to Remember and Devil Wears Prada and
Bring Me the Horizon. People love those bands too. I gotta respect that.
yeah, well, let's get into that in a second. But this was like one of the biggest themes that kind of kept coming up because it was like the big movement at the time. But at the time, you know, like we were just like really kind of already tired of it, and just, you know, we were kind of like we were like the old curmudgeons about it. Like, what is this new stuff that's coming out that's just, and it wasn't that, like, I don't know, that we didn't particularly hate it or think that it was, you know, like we didn't understand it. It just really just seemed like heavy music, like looking back at it now, it seemed to me like heavy music was not really sure what to do with itself. And a lot of the kids that were starting bands and you know, getting like underground popular or moving into the mainstream, you know, like the Hot Topic world and stuff, they were taking like all their influences and just smashing them all together, as opposed to having a little bit more finesse and wisdom with it. I think that's why it came across that way to us, like kind of like this diarrhea or vomit of sounds that didn't have any real focus or direction. But I think that makes sense too for the time, because like, you know, when you and I were growing up, we were influenced by stuff that was either like presented to us by peers or television or the radio, you know, or we go to a record store and we would get recommendations, or we have like those like listening stations where you'd put on a CD and listen to it. Like, we didn't have all of it all at once, but the generation coming up, you know what I mean? Like, I think like one reason, just looking back at it in kind of a retrospect, I think the reason it was happening that way, because it was the first generation that had access to all music all the time. And they were like overwhelmed maybe by how amazing that privilege was, but they didn't know what to do with it. So they just crammed it all together in this sonic vomit. What do you think?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's all, everything's here all at once, or everything's a chimera in the now the social media internet age.
I don't know if I'm correct. Like, I'm not basing that on any data. That's just my gut.
Yeah.
But I don't think I'm totally wrong.
It just makes sense. Yeah. Prior to the I guess the explosion of the internet age and like the post new millennium, things were really presented as one stream at a time. And pop culture was always like much more black and white. This is in, this is out. This is the, you know, hair metal's out, grunge is in. Grunge is out, alternative is in, and so on and so forth. It's like,
right.
It was more, there were a few genres going on at once. There'd be pop, hip hop, and this and that. But there was like, or, you know, like that like kind of 80s form of rap was dead, and then gangster rap is what's in. It's always one thing or the other. So things were like one stream, one at a time, one, you know, one thing, jump from one thing into the next thing. But when you have access to it all at once, I've worked with some clients who were like 14 and were in flannel and loved grunge rock. I'm like, whoa, like that didn't happen in our time. We would go back, like the 70s was seemed to be like the thing in the 90s to like retro 70s, but I didn't like base my identity off the 70s. It was like 70s is cool, but 90s rock and hip hop and metal was like what it was about. So it's a completely different thing. Thus all of this kind of ends up being a chimera, ends up being mixed together.
I think it's still happening though. I mean, there's definitely, like, we're living in like the peak nostalgia age for sure because of the internet, I think. But it's funny because okay, so I was at this show last summer. It was a pop act called Glass Animals. They're kind of like a pop alternative act. But they definitely were hitting a younger crowd. I felt like an old man because it was really like younger college age, I would say. What was the majority of the crowd, and just looking at their styles, like what everybody was wearing, it was like this total hodgepodge of like everything from 60s bell bottoms to like and like halter top kind of stuff to like big baggy clothes to like super, you know, like tight skinny jeans and like lots of like vibrant like 90s colors, but also like a lot of muted, almost like goth kind of stuff. And you know, you'd have the same person would be wearing like studded choker, you know, but also wearing like I don't even know what the name of all the styles are now, but you know, they'd have like a, I don't know, like a flowy, flowery, like almost like a 60s kind of shirt and like skinny jeans. I don't know. It was all over the place. And I think that's also indicative of what we're talking about is like, there is nostalgia. And I think people are interested in the 90s and they're interested in the 80s and even like the 2000s are like a nostalgia era. For like, you know, a lot of those like, that was when the neon colors and stuff were and the like the monster fonts and stuff were really big at Hot Topic. And it's like, but the thing is, it's like, it's not like one thing has gone out and other stuff has come in. Now it seems like everything is in and it's just like a potpourri of your fashion or your music of choice and just put it together. I'm not like judging this at all. I think it's just really interesting because it's so different from what you and I were used to and exposed to.
Yeah, I've always, and I always had a problem with how things were one stream or the other in our age. It was like how in different eras and different expressions of pop culture and music, some things are like amazing. There's genres that I wouldn't touch the 10-foot pole, but there's like a good artist or two or that I would like in even a genre I absolutely abhor, let's say, you know, and
or there was
why
good creative.
should
Yeah, there was
why
good creative. You might not love a genre, but you can't deny like a good, honest, passionate, creative output from something.
yeah, of course. And why should that just die and be forgotten? Or you know, maybe influence things in the background, but why can't I celebrate some 90s genre that's gone, but I love the artists these days because it's everywhere, you know, I could, and so on, you know. Like I've been getting into like a lot of 80s music I missed, like 80s goth. I found I like 80s goth a lot in certain.
Tell you what, let's put a pin in that because I do want to come back to kind of like where you and I are personally at, but let's stick with the comparing the old to new podcast themes for a second. But one thing I want to say before we like kind of move on from this is the word binary is being thrown around a lot nowadays, especially you know because in the political circles. But I think it is indicative of just where we are as a culture right now. And I think you know music and art and fashion and all those kind of things, you know, expression are part of that. Is like I think because of the internet, because of the ability to be aware of all things at all times and have access to all information from all times at all times is like I don't think there is such thing as binary anymore. There is no one movement that is going to you know outshine or suppress another movement. It's like everything's happening at the same time, and people now have the ability and the luxury to kind of pick and choose. And the idea of binary expression is kind of like outdated, you know. And so I think that's interesting, and I think that's good, and I think that's just where we are. But the other side of this whole like the Insanecore, diarrhea core thing that's interesting to look at.
Oh, I also call it ADHD core back then.
ADHD core, yeah.
I wasn't seeing it clearly, I think.
Well, I mean, I agree though. It lacked focus.
Yeah.
It lacked, to me, from what I took from it, it lacked the genre in general lacked like what were they really trying to get across with this music other than look how insane we are.
Yeah.
Because I personally didn't get, even though it was really aggressive and angry edged kind of music, I didn't get a lot of emotion from it because it felt so detached from expression, and it was more about like just throwing everything. It almost felt more like a temper tantrum of music than I'm really trying to say something here, you know. It was like, but which is fine. I'm not judging. Again, like I think that can work, and I think that speaks to certain people, and that's fine. But the thing moving forward from it though, what's really interesting about a lot of those bands from that time is that they are all, most of them are still around, and they're not playing that music anymore for the most part. They've
Yeah.
all evolved past it, but it gave them a starting point. I
Yeah.
think it was really interesting that like a lot of these bands got big during a time where something like that could get big because it felt new and fresh in a way. Yeah, like, you know, like these bands that were mashing together like hardcore breakdowns with like blast beats and, you know, like emo singy,
Screamo kind of
you
stuff.
know, sometimes it like falsetto choruses and, you know, like
Electronica, hip hop.
yeah, oh yeah, all of
It
it.
was mostly metal, but it was like it had like
But the interesting thing is like as the years have gone on since these bands first made a splash, like Bring Me the Horizon is still one of the biggest rock acts ever. A Day to Remember is. Ice Nine Kills is one. I didn't know about them back then, but they, you know, they've been making waves. And it's funny, a lot of these bands have gone, you know, they've experimented and done albums in different sort of like different subgenres of stuff that they had all mashed together before. It's like they realized that they could really say something, they could really get a point across, they could really express something if they focused on one of the things that they were good at and did that, and then put that aside and then went and did other stuff. And I haven't really like got deep into most of this stuff. Honestly, a lot of the stuff that I'm like, and I'm like, think it's safe to say that it's probably true for you too. A lot of the stuff that I'm referencing is stuff that I have learned from Finn McKenzie's Punk Rock MBA channel because he talks
him and
about
a
this
few
stuff.
others.
Yeah. So like he's got more of his ears to the ground with this kind of stuff. I haven't really listened to, other than like hearing random stuff on Sirius XM radio every once in a while. I'm like, oh yeah, there's Bring Me the Horizon. Oh wait, that doesn't sound like anything like the Bring Me the Horizon that I knew from back in the day. So it's, but I do think that a lot of these bands, you know, it's just a sign of like maturity and expressive like experience that they have honed their sound. But it's, I feel like they're still staying true to what they want to do. They just have more of a vision.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting. You know, because a lot of like, dude,
most of these bands, they didn't like sell out or anything, become an all-out pop act, but
well, so I think some people would argue that they did, but I think that they also just understood how to stay in the game.
People will criticize any artist who changes slightly from what their ideal of them is selling out. I had a friend who back in 2001 or so thought that Slipknot's second album was selling out.
I remember
how is that album selling out?
Oh, and he also thought that like Toxicity was selling out.
Oh yeah, Toxicity was a sellout album. It's like sure, you think that, okay.
But back in the day when we recorded that episode about, you know, this genre, I remember we had both said like we didn't think that this music was going to last because it was so, I don't know, hard to like kind of wrap your head around or you know, it was just felt like a splash in the pan kind of thing. And we were kind of right and wrong because all these bands like stopped doing that, but they're still around though.
Which is great.
And they're bigger. All of them are way bigger than I ever would have imagined that they would have been, not by playing that sound. However, I've heard that some of these bands like Bring the Horizon and Day to Remember and stuff have integrated some of their old like grindcore, metalcore kind of elements back into their sound. It's almost like people are nostalgic for what was. You know what I mean? And and so the bands are kind of like re-upping that, but okay, a big thing that this isn't really something we talked about a lot back then, but I do see it. I think it was becoming popularized at the time that we were first making the podcast, and is now like just a cancer in the music industry, which is like modern production. And I don't at all mean overproduced or well produced, like that everything should sound raw and like, you know, basement punk rock kind of sound. But every time that I turn on XM, so, you know, I have XM radio now, so like Turbo, Liquid Metal, or Octane, and anytime it's like a newer band, it sounds so muddy, and not like good muddy, like we used to call corn muddy, and stuff
Yeah.
that just sounded dirty and raw.
The two
But
albums, yeah.
the production that they're doing on most modern acts, and it's not just metal, it's actually like across genres. It's like
Yeah.
they are normalizing all instruments, and they're like kind of engineering them to sound almost like the same, I swear. Because in pop and metal and country, even though I don't really listen to that, but every time that I've heard a little bit, it's like the drums, like the snare sounds the same as the tom, which sounds the same as the kick, which sounds the same as the guitar. Really, you know what I mean? Like, it's like you can tell them apart, but they also they're all at the same level of dynamic range, and they all have the same texture. It's so hard to, it's so subjective to describe this stuff.
Well,
it's so
Dan,
intangible.
there was a video that was going around years ago. I got to find it again, of like how pop music, and I think it should be generalized to popular music, is engineered to subliminally, pull you in and to almost be like hypnotic. And like one of the ways was like
Oh, sure.
saturate everything, so it's just one big wall of sound, overplaying songs, so it becomes your jam because you heard it at the mall so many times. But it had all these subtle ways that like popular music is produced very specifically to hit in your lizard brain. Like they like all the like the chant stuff they do. That's been overdone, which is cool in some forms.
Yeah.
I do love. There's a particular
Godsmack.
album I love that stuff in, but it's it's there to just hit your lizard brain and just rope you in and not physically be good artistic music.
It's
Yeah.
funny though that you bring that up, though, because to me it's totally backfiring, because when I hear music that sounds, it's not the genre that's the problem, the production. When it sounds like everything sounds the same, the vocals and the percussion and the low end and the mids and the highs are all at the same level, and they all kind of, there's no, there's almost like no mix, there's no panning, there's no layering of sound. It's just all mashed in the same kind of texture that it sounds completely, I don't even know how to describe it. Like it has no emotional quality to me at that point.
It's flat.
When everything's up front, when there's no dynamic range, it's just a mass of sound. And it's almost like you're feeling the music more than, like you're feeling it physically.
Yeah.
You know what I can equate it to is like when you're at a show that's so loud you can't really hear anything except for feel the vibrations from the speakers, or like if you're at like a club or something. That's what hearing this stuff is like to me. It doesn't, sure, it's all rhythm based, and that's fine, but it's almost like we're like reverting back to some kind of tribal music, which is just funny, like
rock and roll has implicit tribal elements in it. But that's the whole thing about rock and roll history, which is really cool.
No, I'm not criticizing like the, like the groundwork that was laid to make music like this or anything. What I'm criticizing is that we have so many tools at our disposal to express the things we want to express. But you know what it comes down to is that this music, the production value of the music reminds me more of the production value of a commercial as opposed to the show that it accompanies. So, like on a show or a movie, and sometimes the music's loud and the voices are soft, so you have to keep turning it up and down, so you can hear what they're saying. But then, like, at least it has a dynamic range, and it. But then when it switches over to commercial, it's like, it's like 4 decibels louder, and everything is like all at the top. It seems like even if it's,
and you're numb to it,
camera,
it's like how food is. It's like all these flavor enhancers and MSG are there to be nervous system excitatory, and how like modern food is like so much sugar and other stuff that you're just numb to, like so much sensory stuff at once.
Yeah,
it's like same thing with the music. It's the same kind of paradigm.
I agree.
After a while, I just get like essentially numb to it. That's why I haven't been following mainstream music. Nothing grabs me. It's all
dude, it's not even mainstream music. It's just music now. I really haven't heard a lot of artists, whether they're like legacy stuff from, you know, our youth or whatever, or if they're newer, that differentiate themselves. And I got to say, like, it's been really refreshing every once in a while when like a new Hatebreed song or a Lamb of God song,
Yeah.
something like that comes on. And it sucks because it makes me feel like such a curmudgeon, like, oh, things were only good in my day, but this new stuff is all bad just on principle. It's not true. I want to, I've always, like getting into music, I've always felt like I'm searching after this holy grail that I'll never find. Like, you know, it's because I like why would I keep like investing my time and money and energy into music if I wasn't looking for something good? Like for me, music isn't all just nostalgia. Like, oh, I like this as a kid, so I can listen to it and it brings me warm and fuzzy. Like I can listen to Slipknot now and
Mhm.
and I can feel something that you know that it relates to, or I can relate it to something that's current in my life, and the
Mhm.
not just the lyrics, but also the music itself and the way it makes me feel, and you know the experiences that it gives me. And I have not discovered new bands that make me feel that way. Here's a good example. I want to be
Mhm.
more specific for a second. There's this band that is making a lot of waves right now called Spirit Box.
Mhm.
Have you heard of
Heard of
them?
them. Heard of them. Don't know
They're
them.
okay. It's the former singer and guitarist of I Wrestled a Bear Once, who you and I
Okay.
saw
Yeah, I saw
at
them live.
when I first moved to Richmond. Like,
Mayhem Festival.
no, it was the All Stars
Oh,
tour.
right.
It was at the National in Richmond. It was actually what we talked about on our first episode of the podcast.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
yeah, I Wrestled a Bear Once was like they were definitely part of that whole Insanecore movement. They were all over the place,
Mhm.
um but at least like I remember I listened to them later. I didn't really like love it, but it sounded good.
Yeah.
Like it was recorded well, you know, and like I was like, oh, okay, like this it sounded distinct, like it had its own flavor. But now, so
Mhm.
Spirit Box is making a lot of waves. Like they're doing really well in their niche genre. That, you know, their tours are being supported well and stuff. But and I so because of that and because of their singer, like she's definitely grown past her, you know, her spazzy I Wrestled a Bear Once kind of
Mhm.
uh you know way of doing things. But every time I hear them now, it's so bland and it's so generic, and it's not like it doesn't sound bad. It sounds, I don't know, it's eating just like a cake without frosting.
Mhm.
It's like it's so
Well,
it's so unengaging to me because it all the her everything from her vocals, whether she's singing or screaming, to the percussion, to the guitars, it's all at the same level of mix and production, like we've been saying. And they're just one of the many examples that anytime somebody's like, oh, there's this new band and they're making waves, they're doing great, you know, they're you got to check this new band out. Every time that somebody like in my band recommends some new, I'm sorry, they're
mhm.
like, oh, new metal is back, and you got to check out this band Loathe, or this band, like I don't even know the names of some of them, but
Mhm.
and I'm always like, yes, okay, cool. Like there's bands coming up and they're gonna scratch some itch that I've, you know, like, you know, give me something new and fresh. And even if the music, the songwriting and everything is pretty good, or they're doing something kind of unique and interesting, it sounds like a commercial.
Honestly, I'm in such a different place, and even caring to search for or even listen to what's new. I'm going back and seeing all the stuff I've missed. I
Well, why don't you
I
talk
don't.
about that for a second then? Tell us some
Yeah.
of the stuff you have been going into.
I don't know. I've been getting some genres I never thought I or didn't really know much about, like
Like what?
noise core, or like I don't mean current noise. I mean like no
Sonic Youth?
no 80s 90s anarchist punk type of stuff, or crust punk stuff.
Oh,
Stuff that's the opposite of stuff that's like, and a lot of DIY hardcore stuff I've missed. I just love like old All Out War, and more underground stuff that's just like blah. That's so unproduced, so raw, or some really good 80s goth. I even like some more popular 80s goth. I never thought I would. Or I didn't know much about it. I
right.
I knew goth from industrial and metal goth in the 90s, and I just we were um I knew the Cure, always liked the Cure, but like I didn't know goth. I didn't know the real stream of it, which came partly from punk, partly from like art house 70s rock. I saw a whole thing on it recently. It was really cool.
Name some bands that you've gotten into.
Yeah, Bauhaus, This Is a Mercy, and of course the Cure, Joy Division. Those are the big ones. What's that other one? There's several in that stream, and just stuff that's just like it's weird because we were always it takes me a while to get into stuff that's not like harder guitar driven stuff. So it took me a while. It's like, okay, this is raw and dark and stuff, but it's not the hard guitar driven stuff that always I'm used to like the grunge rock era where it's like it might not be metal guitar, but it's like a wall of sound of distorted guitar grabbing you before anything else. And goth is very different than that. It's more bass driven, more but it's dark. It's raw. Some stuff like some more Sisters of Mercy stuff that was like all over MTV was more, and some of the later 80s Cure stuff was more pop, 80s pop mixed with rock and all that. But some of it was really dark and really some of the more underground stuff in that era. Like Phil Anselmo's recent group in Minor, they're interesting because he's influenced by that stuff. I didn't know it, and looking back on some of the more loose Pantera stuff, even in Pantera, there's some of that influence. I mean, Peter Steele and Negative was big time influenced by 80s goth, big time. They were like hardcore and metal crossover mixed with 80s goth and slowed down and but became their own thing. So stuff that's the streams of stuff that led to stuff, proto grunge type of stuff, garage rock 80s stuff. Get more interested in that stuff. Get more interested in I've been listening to honestly not as much music, not as much searching around like I used to, but I'm learning Spanish, so I've looked up 80s hardcore. And I'm sorry, Mexican hardcore.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and some of these artists, like, it's really cool, but some of them, like much more than like Suicidal Tendencies or crossover hardcore bands, which acted like gangsta. Some of these like Latino hardcore stuff, they look like they are gangsta. They're gangs, but yeah, I don't like hyper produced or this oversaturated. I don't know. I'm yet to be convinced. It's just another part of our culture that's kind of culturally bankrupt.
Yeah.
No one else really to go with it, so it's kind of same stuff, maybe different mixes, but nothing too groundbreaking, grabbing. And a lot of good stuff has been done in the past. So many good stuff that if we've missed wasn't our generation or we were in like when we hit the grunge era, we were like the kids right when grunge was like on decline and becoming alternative. So we knew the big 5 or 6 grunge bands. We didn't know all the smaller ones, all the stuff from the 70s and 80s that led to it. We didn't know. There's a huge stream of stuff underground. Same with punk, same with all those stuff. So
that's a lot of genres though. Isn't like most of a mainstream genre like not known? It's only when it hits it's only when all those underground underdog kind of like stars that influence the bands that really make it is when people start to discover that stuff. And sometimes it never really gets to that point. There's so many genres that only are, I mean, can you imagine if like Korn was only they stopped at Life is Peachy? And like Limp Bizkit never came out and all that, like if new metal could have never really existed in the way that we know it now, because it would have just been like a side note.
And I gotta say, we were the curmudgeon new metal kids who were into the original stream of the before it was getting big, the more harder stuff, the original Korn albums, Soulfly's first album.
Well, even Roots. I would say Roots is a new metal album.
Prior to that, other stuff like before it became more of like a fashion show and cleaned up.
What happened. You could say the same thing about grunge,
Grunge and all that, where the mainstream was like, ooh, let's find other bands kind of like this but more radio friendly. So here's what well, what we're calling alternative. Alternative was there. Alternative was supposed to be mean indie, kind of like underground. That's funny how alternative became mainstream. But yeah,
and I just want to say, like, I hate that we're at this point where we're putting this out there, honestly, that, like, I do. Growing up, I was always really scared of growing up and growing numb, like seeing our friends' parents and teachers and people that just felt really like dispassionate or like disinterested in things. And I know
yeah.
as an idealistic youth, I always wanted to believe that as I got older, I could still hold on to that youthful passion, and music would be
I think these days, this is my cult. I'm really into examining culture. This is more of a cultural critique. I don't think it's that we're the older ones that don't understand the kids' stuff going on these days. I think it's more that what's out these days, and of course it's we're into some of the most extreme stuff or edge stuff. So it's not like it's always so edgy or anything like an older generation would be, but stereotypically at least, it's more that everything is, I don't know, clean and corporate, kind of doesn't have like a much of an edge or a soul or a
yeah, even if it's, I agree, like even if it's really, really heavy, that
yeah
doesn't make it like, I don't know, scary. Oh, it doesn't make it compelling.
yeah yeah
Like things that drew me to bands like Korn or even like Eminem. I never thought I'd get into rap as a kid, but
yeah
Eminem's whole thing, his music, his persona, he was compelling, and he compelled me to want to pay attention, even though I didn't necessarily like that genre at the time, and that's what got me into it. But now when I hear these bands, and like, what's that? I forgot what they're called, but there's some like band out of Russia that people are like, it's the most brutal stuff you've ever heard, and they wear like masks and stuff, but like it's just so bland to me. It's so weak because it's trying so hard to push everything up to 11. All the guitars are like, they're probably like 10 string down tuned to
yeah
mud, just like,
well, that's
and
it.
the
The
vote.
most extreme's already been done. They call it death metal. You just scream
Exactly.
it, and then it's like the most brutal. It's not that hard to be brutal. It's really hard to be good. To grab someone's, and extreme metal is not as emotional, more I think more instinctual, kinetic.
Right.
Is what grabs you, but it's like brutal has been done. Do brutal well. Do brutal in a way that grabs my lizard brain and makes my body move unconsciously to where I'm in
Right.
complete. It's almost
And
shamanistic. It's like I think a lot of extreme metal is like what people don't get who are scared of metal is like it's like a shamanistic, like letting go, like a tribal thing rather than that uptight culture. Like how I always offended people about rock and roll because rock and roll came, you know, 60-70% from African Americans, and there's this more expressive way of being that was like let self go rather than just create beautiful, more uptight, high art music like classical. You know, classical is
yeah,
great, but
Western culture definitely has an elitist kind of
yeah,
under or overtones. I'm not sure, it just
yeah,
always trying to outdo things instead of just
yeah.
be and exist and
hmm
enjoy now, be present.
I feel music that would be seen as like bad or really like old school rock compared to like new metal. I find crust punk more brutal than like some new grindcore ish, highly whatever new band coming out that's like "Bleh," all the time and everything's down tuned. I mean, I've heard breakdowns. I've heard good breakdowns,
Right.
and just because it's like dun, like I'm down like a 10-string guitar, dun dun. I've heard that. That's not hard to do. I remember
Right.
seeing stuff like that I remember being at some hardcore shows in the early 2000s or late 90s, and bands are starting to kind of do that, like just like dun dun. Like oh,
Yep.
you can't get more extreme than that because then you down tune more, you scream more, and sure, like so I've heard it, you know.
Exactly. We've gone down quite a rabbit hole. So just to put a little stamp at the end of this so we can move on real quick is I just want to say that I am not interested in discovering new music that I would enjoy. I just need it to be honest and creative and have a vision and have passion behind it and just to actually speak something to me. So if anybody has any suggestions, I'm definitely open. And I'm not gonna discount it just because it's new. That's not at all what we're trying to say. It's just there's a lot of different factors that are playing into that being problematic at this point in time. Okay, moving on just real quick because we've spent a lot longer on this than I intended to, but that's good. Just a couple of things that were happening around the time that we first were recording this podcast was streaming or just music consumption. You know, like we definitely I think the CD age was still dead 10 years ago, and I'm like, my mind is blown that not only are CDs still a thing, but that also that vinyl has come back. But I understand why vinyl is so popular because it's definitely like its own niche little thing. I don't want to get into all that, but just in terms of like music consumption, you know, we talked a lot about stuff back in the first iteration of the podcast that was very like indicative of like iTunes downloading kind of stuff where we were paying like a certain amount per song or per album. And that's obviously is still around. That's a thing. But I think early on in our show back then, Spotify was just coming out, and I think it had started in Europe, I believe, and it was just coming to America. And I had tried it out back then, but I think it's interesting to look back and see what's changed since then. Because now, you know, Spotify was like the first like big one, but now it's like everybody is trying to compete with that Netflix model of having everything at your fingertips at all times kind of thing. And that, so I think in addition to the streaming, the movie and television market with the Netflixes and Disney Pluses and Hulus and everything of the world, I think the same bubble is expanding with streaming music platforms. And obviously I think Spotify is still like the big dog, but Apple Music, you know, is there, and Amazon Music and all the other ones. But it's still frustrating to me though, like to not have had foresight, because I think around the time that we were making our podcast a while ago was around the time that I was also I was just getting out of downloading. Like I had definitely stopped buying CDs, but I think I was like just falling out of interest in paying for you know, every new album that came out, like $10 an album or $15 an album on iTunes or whatever. And then, you know, and I, that was because things like Spotify were coming out, but now I'm still kind of frustrated with the idea of paying a subscription fee in general, because we have this huge library of MP3s that we ripped from CDs and that we downloaded from the early 2000s era of you know, downloading legal. I'm talking about legal stuff. I'm not talking about all the BitTorrenting and everything. All the music that I have on my hard drives is stuff that I paid for. It's frustrating because I barely put that stuff on now because it's all on Spotify or whatever. And it's like, I don't really have a point here. I'm just venting a little frustration. It's just like, as technology changes so fast, we barely have time to like collect something in a certain format before the format changes and becomes obsolete. So, and what that's done to me is it's made me not want to invest in anything. And I think that's another reason that I'm not as up on modern popular music in any genre, is because I don't want to like invest in the consumption of it and then have it go away in a couple of years and then have to start over. I don't really know what else to say about that.
Given that much thought, like, makes sense.
But I mean, but on the flip side, it is really nice to have, you know, a streaming service that is relatively affordable, that has like all your library, you know, for the most part, plus everything else that you could ever want. Though, you know, there are some big glaring holes, like a lot of the indie and local and independent stuff that you and I collected over the years will never be on those services, you know. And so I'm still grateful to have the digital, you know, owned media, as opposed to it just being a licensed stream by somebody. Because there is something to be said, I think, about like, you know, this, like the giving all these corporations control over our products. Like, you know, nowadays, most of the physical media that we own is really not, we don't own it. You know, like when you have a DVD or a phone, you are paying that corporation for the privilege of them giving you access to media,
Yeah.
but you don't own it. And there's a sustainable factor there that always makes me a little anxious, is like, how much money do I really want to invest in these companies that are treating me like, I don't know, like an untrustworthy child, that I can't have full access to something. Oh, well, okay. So speaking of consumption, one thing I'm astounded by in 2020, almost 2022, as we record this, it's like a couple days before 2022. This will come out in 2022 though. How are full-length albums still a thing?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Don't
Because
know.
we talked about that way back, and I've in different iterations. Like I talked about that on my other podcast with Jeremiah on our Musicast. Like it's been like 12 years since we recorded that, and we were talking about albums and how, like, you know, we figured that because of the digital era, like, why put out an album and put all that time and money and resources into, you know, like into producing it and then touring on it and then going through that cycle, when you can release a single once a week if you want. Like, you know, Machine Head has been doing this for a while, that they were releasing singles, you know, and putting like a lot more focused, you know, marketing and stuff behind just a single. And videos, you know, they had it all, and then they would move on to the next single, and you kind of, because in a market that's so oversaturated, like, why not keep the train rolling, as opposed to, you know, like the Deftones model of like, well, we put out an album and we're going to tour for a while, and then we're going to disappear for a while and make our next album. And it's like, I don't still think that's relevant anymore. I'm just amazed. I guess my only really point here is I'm just amazed that albums are still such a popular format for music release. I love albums, and I love listening to albums all the way through if they're worth it, but I don't understand why it's still like a standard thing. Do you have any insight?
Interesting, it is, and there's a lot of other ways to do it, and I don't know why it's still there. It still happens.
I wonder if at any, because, you know, we've been looking at this now for like almost like 15-20 years, is like the relevancy of an album. An album used to be an album because, you know, of the format of the media. Like you could fit 4 or 5 songs on one side of a record and then the other on the other side, or something like that. And then cassettes and CDs, like you could just fit more music on it. But, you know, when music first started being recorded, as you know, and we've talked about before, like it was singles. Like it was all about like radio play for, you know, Elvis and Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald and stuff. Like they didn't release albums, you know, other than like, you know, to put their hits out there and then have some other stuff to go with it. Like, you know, it was usually covers or just lesser material, you know. But like the modern album thing is, I just thought was like so out of relevancy and out of flavor, but it's still going, and like I'm just surprised. But I don't know if we'll ever see a time where that completely, I mean, I think, and again, we've talked ad nauseum about this in the past, but I'm just, the reason I'm touching on it still now is because it's still a thing, and because, you know, we were predicting stuff 10-12 years ago that bands were just be putting out, you know, regular singles or EPs and stuff like that, and maybe then putting that stuff into an album later. But it seems to be that that's still kind of like the exception, not the rule. And I'm just curious if it's going to change in our lifetime, because I would have thought it would have changed by now easily. Speaking of which, a lot of these legacy bands that you know, like Machine Head was a big theme of our old podcast. We talked a lot about how, you know, Machine Head at the time was like still at their peak and stuff, or it seemed like they were. But like all these bands that we love from our youth, I really can't, other than maybe Slipknot, I can't name one other than Slipknot that's still like really relevant to me. Even if they're still around, they're almost pathetically like still going, you know. And like Deftones, I've been so disappointed in their past couple albums, and even though like Ohms was supposed to be this return to form masterpiece, it felt so flat to me, just so generic and derivative of there was nothing on there that they did that they haven't done better before. I hate just, I guess this is going to be our curmudgeon episode because I'm so over, like, Machine Head has gone back to being a generic thrash metalcore sound, when they were being so creative and stuff for a while. And like Soulfly, ugh, don't even get me started. And I mean, like Lamb of God's latest release, it's just so generically Lamb of God. It's fine. It doesn't suck, but it's just like, it's disappointing because, like I said earlier, I just really wanted to feel that as I got older, that didn't mean I have to get numb and disconnected with the things that I was passionate about as a younger person. But these bands are not helping.
So I don't really pay attention to much anymore.
Well, one thing I can say though, that on a more constructive note, is even though I'm not sure like if it's a good or bad thing, in 2012, at one of our final episodes of the podcast back then, I predicted that we had a discussion about like, was nu metal dead or was it going to have a revival? And like almost 10 years later, I'm going to take credit that I called it. Like nu metal was going to come back around, because remember at the time, like 10 years ago, nu metal was still like a bad word. Like it was like, nu metal. It was a joke. But Limp Bizkit just put out a new album that people seem to love, which I think is total trash. But it's Limp Bizkit. Like, why would I think anything else? But like, and
I'm a curmudgeon from Limp Bizkit. I love the first one, and I never liked anything past that. I gotta be honest.
I'm the same.
When Korn's been up and down for me. Korn's put some great albums, even past being decline periods. One thing I've always appreciated about Korn, they've been able to make
solid.
Yeah,
they're still solid.
I liked their last one. Like,
yeah.
What?
So, but I just think it's funny because not only are nu metal legacy bands still going, but
and I don't dislike this. I never jumped on I hope it didn't, the hate Limp Bizkit bandwagon. There was like, love them because they were trendy, but hate them because they were Limp Bizkit too. It was just, I just didn't like the stuff past the first album.
Exactly. I think we were part of the original wave of like disillusioned Limp Bizkit fans, where we really liked what they brought originally, and then they became such a product and such a fashion show, and they were so overly marketed and slick, and they got too big for their britches too fast. They didn't retain that kind of like authenticity that Korn was able to hold on to. But whatever. I mean, it worked for them. Like they got popular. But that Limp Bizkit's not really what I want to focus on here. I'm proud of myself for actually like having some foresight for once, that not only are the legacy bands still like either coming back or still going, but like the generation that has come up, influenced by that music, they're now putting out, there's a lot of bands that are like, Loathe is like a very Deftonesy metalcore influenced band, and I don't love them. The Knocked Loose, Knocked Loose is not nu metal really, but they're like more of a hardcore throwback, but they definitely have some of those more like, that they bring in like electronic influences and stuff. So like that period, just to like answer the question that we asked back then, like, would nu metal ever be cool again? The answer is yes. It is cool again. It actually is like seen as like a like a legacy genre that has a voice in the modern. It's not just like a side note or a joke like it was 10 years ago. It's actually like a legitimate thing. So I hope moving forward though, that people do remember nu metal past, like, I don't know, Follow the Leader and Limp Bizkit's peak, and even like Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory, and actually look at what like nu metal was to me, was one of the last movements of heavy music that was creative and bold and passionate and real before, of course, before it got scooped up. But I really couldn't say that about heavy music right now. Everything just seems to be derivative and nostalgia. But that's true in all areas of culture. So I'm really curious to see if anything is to evolve in general.
Well, there's a level of psychological development, social development above just being a hodgepodge. It's being integrative. and I don't know what that would mean for music, but yeah.
Well, we'll just have to stay tuned and see. And if something comes up, we'll talk about it here on the podcast. But I think we've exhausted all this stuff for now. Dave, thank you for taking the time, and I'll talk to you next time we have something to talk about.
My pleasure.
One aspect of the previous iteration of this podcast that I want to make sure stays in place is featuring some music each episode, especially since this is a music-related podcast. And since this episode focused on comparing past to present, another major theme of the original run of this podcast was how my time on the Hawaiian island of Maui influenced and evolved my interest and taste in music. In our 4th episode, I interviewed Erin Smith, then the lead singer of the Maui-based band The Throwdowns, and I featured their music throughout the show's original stint. Unfortunately, since that original run, The Throwdowns broke up and stopped releasing music. So, to make sure that their music lives on, I'm going to continue to feature them on this podcast here and there. This episode's song pick will be Erin Smith's solo version of the Throwdowns song Stolen Car from her 2nd solo album, American Boy. You can hear the Throwdowns version on episode 4 of this podcast, which was from their 2011 album Legs of Their Own. Erin Smith continues to make music since her time in the Throwdowns, which you can find at erinsmith808.com.
Driving
be sure to visit breathingunderwater.us. Follow me on Instagram at breathingunderwater1 and drop me a line at breathingunderwater1@gmail.com. Please note that I do not claim any ownership of any media presented in this podcast, which is only used for promotional purposes unless otherwise noted. And all views and opinions are those of the person expressing them and do not represent any other entities discussed in this podcast.